this panel today called Neurostimulation, First Line of Therapy. The name itself is actually evolving almost as fast as the profession. And I'd like to introduce the panel from next to me across the chairs, Dr. Mark Demitrack, who's an MD. He's a Vice President and Chief Medical Officer of Neuronetics in Malvern, Pennsylvania. Dr. Demitrack is a board-certified psychiatrist with over 20 years of experience in both academic and industry settings. At Neuronetics, he designed and supervised the clinical development program for the NeuroStar TMS therapy system for the treatment of patients with pharmacoresistant major depression. He earlier was Assistant Vice President of Global Medical Affairs at Neuroscience in Wyeth, and he was once the medical director of the new antidepressant team at Lilly Research Laboratories, where he led the development teams for the antidepressant duloxetine, better known to the world as Cymbalta. Dr. Emad Eskandar, MD, Director of Stereotactic and Functional Neurosurgery, Director of Neurosurgery Residency Training Program, and Professor at Harvard Medical School. He specializes in the treatment of epilepsy, movement disorders, trigeminal neuralgia, brain and spine tumors, and he is the Charles Anthony Professor of Neurosciences at Harvard Medical School. He also heads an active basic research laboratory. We'll learn a little bit more about that as we go into this. It's a well-awarded program. A recent study published in Nature found that part of the brain called the cingulate cortex plays an important role in adapting to varying degrees of cognitive difficulty. He's the receiver, and his group, along with his group, of a $30 million grant from DARPA for a system to treat neuropsychiatric disorders, and his group has also received generous grants from NIH and NSF. Frank Fischer is the Chief Executive Officer and Board Member of NeuroPace Incorporated. He spent more than 30 years in senior management experience in the medical device industry. He's served on the NeuroPace Board of Directors since 1998 and as its CEO since January 2000. Prior to that, Mr. Fischer was President and Chief Executive Officer of Heartport, a cardiac surgery company. He was President and CEO and Director of Ventratex, a company that pioneered implantable cardiac defibrillators from 1987 until 1997. He's also on the Board of Directors of the Epilepsy Foundation, the Board of Trustees of Babson College, and the boards of a number of privately held medical device companies. Dr. Lothar Krinke is the Vice President and General Manager of the Neuromodulation Deep Brain Stimulation business team at Medtronic. He leads the global cross-functional DBS business team that is responsible for developing and executing that global strategy. Prior to this, he was Vice President of Research and Business Development for the neuromodulation sector. His group managed drug infusion therapy programs funded by the Ventures Organization, as well as business development and IP. He joined Medtronic in 2004 as Senior Director, Bioscience Technology Development. He has over 10 years of medical strategy expertise from top management and consulting firms. He received the Rumbaugh Award for dedication to and achievements in diabetes research from the Juvenile Diabetes Research Foundation International. Ben Pless has more than 25 years of experience developing and bringing to market implantable medical devices. Most recently, he was the Chief Operating Officer and Chief Technical Officer of NeuroPace, a privately held company developing electronic implantable devices for the treatment of neurological disorders such as epilepsy. Prior to joining NeuroPace in 2000, he was responsible for worldwide development activities for the Cardiac Rhythm Management Division at St. Jude Medical. He previously served as Vice President of Product Development for Ventratex. He was a founder of Ventratex, where he was instrumental in the development of one of the first implantable cardiac defibrillators. He received a BSEE from MIT and attended graduate school at Rice University. He is a named inventor on approximately 100 patents and patent applications. That was a long introduction, but we're covering a lot of ground because we're looking at the convergence of a number of specialties into a general area which has, we're going to check this in a second, a general title of neuromodulation, but you've also heard other terms such as electroceuticals and neurostimulation. So the first thing I would like to ask is, what is neuromodulation and where is it now?
So I'm happy to take that. So the first point is, of course, the brain is fundamentally an electrical organ. It senses and conveys information electrically. And So neuromodulation is the use of various kinds of electrical signals, possibly pharmaceuticals, possibly stem cells, to try and restore function to the brain where it's lost, or to modify it or improve it in certain chronic conditions and restore a more normal state. So it's a broad and rapidly emerging field, and there are many different approaches and tactics to trying to address these problems. And with the rapid evolution of understanding the neuroscience and the technology, we're on the verge of literally a revolution in being able to address many disorders that were unthinkable before.
What are the most common disorders showing success already?
So the established treatments currently are Parkinson's disease, essential tremor, dystonia, epilepsy, and obsessive compulsive disorder as far as brain stimulation. And then there's, of course, spinal cord stimulation for pain. I may be missing some others.
Major depression?
Major depression is not with invasive, but with non-invasive technologies.
Earlier in the introduction, I said we've been aware of this, meaning on the street, we've been aware of this in the general public for maybe 10 years and more intensively 5. But really, as all of you know, this has been, some of the craft and art of this neuromodulation has been around for decades, even earlier. How did it come about, and how did it enter mainstream?
Well, I think that the very first applications came in terms of implantable systems, came from cardiac device manufacturers. And there were modifications of those cardiac devices. So I go back to the 1970s, companies like Cordis and Medtronic, for example, made custom devices for physicians to treat on a one-off type of basis a number of different disorders. And that was kind of the beginning of the evolution, and experience and modifications to those systems continued from that point forward.
As an aside, was there any entry point for ECT, electroconvulsive therapy? Is this a part of neuromodulation in general?
Well, certainly from the point of view of the psychiatrist on the panel, it absolutely is. And so the use of electrical techniques as a therapeutic strategy has a history that stretches back to 1938 with the introduction of electroconvulsive therapy.
Is it fair to say that back then it worked, but nobody knew why?
Yes, and I think that's probably somewhat fair to say nowadays.
That was the next question. So this is an exciting new field, but there still seems to be a large area of, if not doubt, at least lack of knowledge about why it's getting the results you're seeing.
Well, maybe I can take this. So first of all, we should all realize that it is a developed field, and it is a commercially extremely successful field. We're talking probably close to $10 billion of revenue in that overall field if you count things like cochlear implants, spinal cord stimulation, which is several $billion, and so on. So while it is a focused field where certain specialists deploy it, it is certainly commercially successful. And ultimately, and I think we're going to get to this maybe later a little bit more in detail, I think there is very little doubt that these therapies work. We have incredible clinical evidence, particularly in Parkinson's, with 5 or 6 RCTs. And we are getting a better understanding of the neuroscience that supports it. It is really a little bit of the hesitancy of patients and referring neurologists that's holding back the field. It's not technology. It is really society needing to adopt something that's perceived as highly invasive. Think back of maybe the time when cardiac pacemakers were new. We were talking the 40s, right? 40s and 50s. Patients probably were concerned about having a battery implanted in their chest, but today, my neighbor just told me, oh no, no big deal, just got a pacemaker. I think we will hopefully see in 20 years or so, people saying, gee, no big deal, I just got a brain pacemaker.
Are we already seeing that in areas like Parkinson's disease, where patients, once they hear their prognosis, seem to be increasingly willing to have implants to modify their neurological state?
I think that's gradually changing. It's a slow process. There's kind of a cultural and generational acculturation that happens to occur. At the moment, probably something like 10 to 15% of eligible Parkinson's disease patients ultimately get deep brain stimulation surgery, in spite of the fact that there's been 6 large trials demonstrating its efficacy, published in the New England Journal of Medicine, widely available. And so there's certainly an educational element to it, and then there's sort of a change of mindset on both the patients and the treating physicians, and some of that just occurs with time as people grow and see the technology and see the benefit and train with it, particularly as residents, and they're much more willing to adopt it going forward.
You mentioned,
one thing just to add to that is the invasiveness of the therapies are getting much better. That if you look at the pacemakers, the original pacemakers were carried around in wheelbarrows,
The first implants were abdominal.
And first implants were abdominal
And
and were
lasted all of
open
10 months.
and were open chest, and then you had to go back in every year to replace them. And now a pacemaker, is very small. In fact, there's discussions about whether they're getting to be too small, because they get lost in the body. And so I think that the change of invasiveness of the therapies is really important. But the perception is that they're much more invasive than they are. I mean, I have a vested interest in autonomic technology, but we make a device which is implanted through the mouth, and it literally has no scars, and it's invisible after implantation.
what is that device?
So it's a small neurostimulator that stimulates a structure called the sphenopalatine ganglion, and it treats severe headache, cluster headache in particular, which is the worst pain syndrome known to man. We're working on severe migraine as well, and just for disclosure, it's in clinical studies in the United States, and we're commercializing in Europe. But this also comes back to the mechanism of action. I think that we kind of glossed over that, but the rational basis for these therapies is actually, I think, quite good. The details in many areas are not well known, but there are good scientific reasons to believe that they work. I mean, particularly for spinal cord stimulation, for deep brain stimulation for movement disorders, which have replaced surgical procedures. For our device for the sphenopalatine ganglion, that's been a target for headache and pain relief for 100 years. So, part of what is going to, I think, make this therapy penetrate to the point where it should to provide benefit to patients is people understanding that the mechanism of action is understood and the invasiveness being really quite acceptable to the patients.
You mentioned a device, and speaking about people's acceptance of things being inserted or implanted, you mentioned a device that's inserted by mouth. Where does that end up?
So it's implanted, the incision is made over the third molar, and it turns out that that's a convenient way to access the anterior skull base.
So you're going through the palate?
So no, not through the palate. It's between the cheek and the gum, it's really in the gum line. And plastic surgeons go in there. You have a thing called a buccal fat pad. So if you want to have poochier cheeks, they augment the buccal fat pad. If you want to have narrow cheeks, they pull the buccal fat pad out.
Is that a new feature that you got?
So there's recreational
Yeah.
use for the product in that regard. But basically, it's a well-known access to the skull base, but mostly for plastic surgeons. So the people that not surprisingly, that know about minimally invasive techniques are the plastic surgeons who do aesthetic surgery. And so there's a possibility of piggybacking on that to implant devices to go to therapeutic targets, which is what we did in this case.
Got it. You mentioned earlier trials. That raises the issue of the apparently speedy evolution of this technology and the apparently ponderous evolution of approvals, trial processes, funding. How are those two things running in parallel? The speed at which your technology is developing and the speed with which you can get it through trials into mainstream acceptance and approval?
Well, maybe I'll take a stab at that one. Given the fact that a mere 17 years ago, we started NeuroPace, and we got our first product approved in November of last year, of 2013. So it was over 16 years from creation of the company to approval of the first product. And what had to be done was the basic research to figure out how to implement the concept, the product development, both with external versions of the system as well as implantables, human feasibility studies, human pivotal trial, a regulatory submission and the activity associated with going through FDA, and getting approval. And now we're in the process of beginning commercialization. So it's really the first access, if you will.
17 years.
For 17 years, exactly.
I mean, I think the process, even FDA recognizes that it's sometimes is overly ponderous, and there's a move afoot sort of to accelerate that process. It still represents a significant bottleneck once you have a pretty compelling technology to get FDA approval. But there's clearly a move to kind of speed up that timeline, and so hope is that that will not be the case going forward. It won't take 17 years to get something, and it's particularly true for adjacent technologies. If you already have one technology and you're applying it for a different indication, something like that, it's a much faster process than if it's a completely de novo technology.
Hand in hand. Go ahead.
Although I would add, approval is one thing. I think Frank already alluded to this. That doesn't get you reimbursement, right? We also need to have the economic evidence to support the wide adoption of this therapy. So that's why I'm particularly excited about an adjacent field where we link sensors, external sensors, internal sensors, to our devices that actually create quantifiable outcomes. So think of it in Parkinson's, could be a simple accelerometer like my Fitbit here. That device then could tell whether a patient has motor fluctuations, which is exactly what DBS treats. And so then the institutions can show how a patient is doing before and after the implant in a very quantifiable way. Just think about pacemakers, right? Electrophysiology is ultimately measurable, right? There's no physician assessment how the patient is doing. You can measure the electrophysiology, and that's where we need to go in our field as well. And obviously, Frank is a real leader in that space.
So fueling this is always going to be money. Where's the funding coming from? A government, private sector, VC, institutions?
Effectively, the vast majority on the device side is private. It's venture capital funding for early stage companies or perhaps corporations. There are more and more corporations now that are making strategic investments earlier in the cycle, but very little of the money comes from government funding.
President Obama said recently that his first sign that the Affordable Care Act was going to be a success was when they stopped calling it Obamacare. And he has also been credited with the institution of the Brain Research through Advancing Innovative Neurotechnologies, known as the Brain Initiative. Is that an important part of this development?
I think basically if you think about the development, as we said, it's been going on for decades. What it is kind of a recent acknowledgement of the importance and basically a program put together for government funding. So right now, there are grant applications that are being written to try to look for funding, with this Brain Initiative and whatever else. And I think it'll do a lot to kind of spur particularly applications of existing devices. But it's a much more recent kind of development than something that's been going on long term.
If I may add to that, it is an important development in acknowledging that this is a huge area. We have an aging population. There are going to be a lot of neurodegenerative diseases. It's a big public health burden, a big healthcare cost. And I think it has the effect of helping to focus people's attention, which is very important. And it can catalyze really the development of next generation technologies that can be used for broader indications than what is currently available. And so there have been some very focused efforts, including, for instance, this DARPA effort that you alluded to try and use closed-loop stimulation, where you have a sensing component, a stimulation component, to treat a much broader range of disorders than we currently treat. Things like post-traumatic stress disorder, major depression, drug addiction, generalized anxiety disorder. And even if one of those becomes successful, those are maybe an order of magnitude bigger than what we currently treat, say, for Parkinson's disease.
DARPA's Dr. Jeff Ling yesterday talked about being able to use brain signals to control an F-35 joint fighter, which is a dramatic application. But does DARPA have the same kinds of interest in financing your kinds of research to that degree, $30 million plus? Is it going to be military application, or are there other wider applications?
So, like for instance, this is not a classified project. It's open. It's, you know, they want to treat disorders of interest to the Department of Defense, veterans, but these problems occur in civilians with they have a very high prevalence civilian population. You know, if you combine major depression, drug addiction, generalized anxiety, you're talking tens of millions of people. So, if it works in veterans, it'll work in civilians as well.
Speaking of veterans, are there any applications in neuromodulation for PTSD?
That's that's like probably the most straightforward problem that we're tackling. That's the one we're tackling first because we think scientifically we have the best rationale for how to use closed loop stimulation where we have a sensing and a stimulating component.
Are you using electroceuticals for that or magnetism?
It's electrical. It's kind of like DBS but with sensing.
There's actually applications of that with non-invasive technology that our company makes, transcranial magnetic stimulation. So investigations of in PTSD are actually a fairly interesting area of combination research because one of the approaches to PTSD involves psychotherapy-based treatments. The types of treatments that are provided with TMS operate on the same neural substrate, namely higher cortical functions that psychotherapy operates on. So some of the more exciting sort of horizons of research with TMS application have to do with combination treatments of a non-invasive neurostimulation treatment like TMS with a psychotherapy-based treatment.
And Dr. Demitrack, you appear to have a classic convergence of pharmacological approaches to medicine and also neuromodulation approaches. Is this going to be a happy partnership in the future? Is there going to be competition, or are we going to see more refined convergences of these two technologies?
Actually, I think it's going to be the latter, the convergence of the technologies. Clearly, in my area, in psychiatry, for treatment-resistant depression, the dominant approach has been a pharmaceutical solution up till now. But with the emergence of a more modern understanding using largely neuroimaging-based technologies, we have a much different perspective on the neural networks that actually subserve the regulation of mood and anxiety. So in the future, what I expect to see is that there's going to be more work understanding how these different types of approaches actually serve complementary purposes in improving the outcome.
We hear regularly about the cost of pharmaceutical treatments, the cost of R&D, and then the end cost of a particular pill or treatment. Are we seeing the same kinds of relative cost of development and sale in electromodulation, or is it more economical?
Well, you know, clearly, you know, we heard earlier about the immunotherapies that are contemplated for Alzheimer's, and you know what impact that could have on the healthcare system. So clearly, medical devices are relatively expensive. The application of medical devices are relatively expensive, but it can be one time. So, by the way, it's not just the stimulator that is it's expensive, but of course the surgical procedure. But long term, you have to think about the fact that you put in an ideal world, you put the implant in once and then don't have any follow-on costs, where drugs will, of course, occur over and over again. So we need to address this over time. But certainly, just like in the cardiac field, as volumes increase even more, prices will drop. That is clear. But the procedures have to come along with this as well, because the cost is not just the device; it is also the hospital stay, the surgical procedure. You know, we need to reduce the time that it takes to put an implant in, for example.
The other thing that happens, though, or potentially can happen with devices, is there can be improvements in terms of the longevity of the device. So a device that might be designed today to last for 4 years, tomorrow might last 8 years. So you've gotten 4 additional years at no additional cost from the device perspective. It's not true with pharmaceuticals. If you're going to take a pill, you're going to take a pill, and you're going to take it typically daily. So.
Yeah, I think the case in point would be a pediatric dystonia patient.
I'm sorry?
A pediatric dystonia patient. There are children that have been implanted younger than 7 years of age for dystonia. These leads are expected to last for decades. I mean, most neurosurgeons would not expect to have to change a lead very often. I don't know what you think, Emad, but think of how long these devices can theoretically last.
That leads us, we're also getting questions from the audience through Yorn, and it also, it's an opportunity, everybody here has given their corporate associations. We'd like to welcome representatives from Boston Scientific, and I'm not sure if this question came from them today, but it's from the audience. How much attention is given to potential unintended consequences of the treatments by screening for neuronal damage, which may not present immediate or physical symptoms? And that raises also the general question of side effects compared to pharmacological solutions.
Yeah, if I could start on that. So, we were just talking about the costs, and, one thing I'd point out is that in many cases, medical devices are solving problems that the drugs can't solve. So, if you have somebody who has sudden cardiac death, nobody thinks about doing anything but putting in an implantable defibrillator because that's a therapy that works. And what we're eventually going to start seeing is that even though the medicines are clearly critical to the care of these patients, at some point there's a realization that the therapy that actually works is a medical device. And so getting to that medical device therapy sooner is really important for the health of the patient. There's no point in the patient going for years without getting effective therapy. But relative to the the unintended side effects, one of the real advantages of implantable devices is that they're very targeted. I mean, unlike a medicine which goes to every organ in the body and truly can have unintended consequences, for most of the devices that are out there today, the safety profiles are very well understood. There are surgical side effects, of course. I mean, pain and swelling, and in rare cases there can be neuronal damage, but they're very well understood and easy to manage. Once the device is implanted, 2 years, 5 years, it's very rare that there's any subsequent, newly arising side effect from implanted devices. So from that standpoint, I would argue, and have argued many times, that they're much safer and much less invasive than chronic medicine, putting people on, for example, I'm in the pain space now, and people get put on chronic steroids. And that ends up with osteopenia and all kinds of other hormonal issues, which really is much more severe, I think, than the kinds of side effects that you get with neuromodulation. So.
Can I maybe add to this?
I would still have a response regarding pharmacology.
In the area of treatment-resistant depression, the issue of the tolerability of a non-invasive neuromodulation treatment compared to the increasing medical complexity of combination antidepressant treatments, or even the potential long-term cognitive outcomes of electroconvulsive therapy. There's a dramatic difference between the tolerability and benefits associated with a non-invasive neuromodulation technique like TMS. And the physics that we have involved in this technology is also fairly well understood, since it really exploits a medical technology that we know quite a lot about, and that's MR technology.
Could you explain that?
We're using high-strength pulsed magnetic fields with the TMS device to induce an electric current in the brain as a conductor. So we're using a depolarizing strength level induced current, but fundamentally we're using the same type of physics that's at play in an MR imaging.
And to come back to where we came in, do we know why it works?
Well, we certainly have a lot better technology to understand the mechanism of action of the medications. We have a long way to go to understand the true pathophysiology of major depression. But compared to where we were back in 1938 with the application of a convulsive electrical stimulation, we certainly know a lot more about the mediating brain events that occur with a pulsed magnetic field and an induced current.
So if even the pharmacologists are venturing into neuromodulation, and all these treatments seem so efficacious, so economical, seem to have such relatively fewer side effects, why is the uptake so apparently slow? Where are the obstacles to research funding, monetization, approval, distribution through a doctor's prescription pad to anybody out here?
Well, I think that there's a couple of reasons for that. The first is, if you think about the pathway in terms of getting a treatment to a patient, the pathway is more tenuous, if you will, for a patient that would get a medical device implant as contrasted to a physician writing a script for a pill. And the other, if you, again, we're thinking about devices that are primarily being eventually prescribed by the neurology community, the neurology community in general has had less exposure to devices as a therapy than other specialties. And so they're more hesitant, I think, to think in terms of a device as contrasted to think in terms of medication. That's an education issue. It's not, you know, one that can't be solved. It certainly can be solved. But I think it's kind of natural and inherent. And then the next piece of it is that neurologist doesn't do the implant. The neurologist needs to refer the patient somewhere for that implant to get done. And it may be eventually to a comprehensive epilepsy center like at Mass General, and the implant may be done then by neurosurgeons such as Emad.
Is there an age barrier among the medical community, doctors, therapists, to the acceptance of this and therefore the recommendation of it?
I wouldn't categorize it necessarily as age, but it's kind of the entrance into the profession. You know, if you've got a fellow that's graduating, they're looking for areas of interest and things that are exciting, and they'll pick it up, as contrasted to somebody that's got a really busy schedule and just doesn't, you know, have the time and energy to look at things that are new.
That seems to be a common issue for therapists, that they're so busy they either can't read the new literature or they can't put it to effect in their own field. Is that a fair comment?
Part of it, I think that as Frank pointed out, it's not, you know, age per se. A lot of it is, you know, experience and comfort. So someone who trained and grew up in a, you know, in a system where, say, Parkinson's disease or epilepsy was essentially exclusively a pharmacologically treated disorder, you know, it just doesn't really register on their radar screen that there's this other option. On the other hand, if you have residents and fellows that go through training now, they see the patients, they see the outcomes, it's a very real part of their experience, then there's no trouble carrying that forward into their own practices. And it is hard to kind of, you know, have these dramatic change in how you manage and treat patients once you have an established pattern.
So if we don't call it an age barrier, would we call it a generational issue, that younger graduates are seeing more of these things in residency or even in med school?
I think that's fair.
That's right.
I think
It's also a general awareness
I hate to
issue.
think of it as an age issue. Certainly have seen older people be just as innovative as younger people. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. But one other thing I would just add to the equation here is the role of the patient is changing as well. I think that you know, there has often been a understanding of whether a patient is successfully treated, for example, are they medically refractory or not, is really a physician-centric view of the care of the patient, as opposed to patient disability. I mean, if the patient is disabled, they should be getting different therapies, regardless of whether or not the clinician may think that they're medically refractory or not. And so that's something that you know, obviously the internet has played a big role in, but also I think there's just a greater understanding that patients need to have more control and more say in their care. And I certainly know some centers adopt new therapies because patients show up saying that they want them.
So,
can I say something about the patient? So first of all, for the most part, these therapies are not directly life-saving, at least not from the patient perspective. Now, of course, your therapy is life-saving because you prevent suicides, right? But it is not where the patient would say, gee, I need this implant, like the pacemaker, because otherwise I die, or I need the shunt because otherwise I might die. They're quality of life therapies. And even pain, people might say, well, I can wait a little bit longer. So we need to keep that in mind when we think about the patient. We did some patient market research. We asked patients because we were convinced if we just did the therapy asleep. So we thought maybe the reason why patients are afraid of DBS is because they have to be awake during the surgery. That didn't turn out to be quite true. So certainly patients are worried about dying. You know, there is a very small, by the way, very, very small chance of dying during the surgery, much smaller than other very commonly adopted surgeries. But patients, which, you know, in hindsight makes sense to me, but patients are concerned about other aspects. And having an implant in the brain they have sort of an emotional response to this. What if this device changes my personality? Yeah. What if it changes my intelligence, my ability to relate to others in the community? And that's a very emotional response that is, I think we have the scientific answers, but science isn't going to answer these deeply emotional questions. I think we need to get that across. Every patient needs to know another patient that they can talk and say, hey, what was it really like? Did it work? And that's why I'm really confident that we are about to get over this threshold where everyone knows someone who has one of those brain implants or has a pain stimulator. So it becomes more common to adopt this therapy. It is not experimental. There's 125,000 patients with DBS. There's, hundreds of probably a million patients with spinal cord stimulators.
Just a couple more comments to follow up on Lothar's point. One is, and this is very true with epilepsy patients, that many times are just loaded with anti-epileptic drugs, and frankly, they have a lousy quality of life as a result of that. They're just getting through the day. And to Lothar's point, that person probably isn't going to be looking for another therapy because they're not able to, but their caregivers are, and their families are, and they're going to say, what is it that can get done here to make this, to let my son or my daughter live a normal life as compared to what it is that they're living now. So we see a fair amount of that, but it means another aspect of who it is that needs to be reached out to relative to the potential benefits.
Ben talked about or alluded to a better informed patient, and when we came in we were talking about, or the theme was Star Trek and the space program when the final frontier was out there, but perhaps coincidentally that period produced the technology which enables you to do what you're doing now, and it also produced the technology with the internet for a patient to become much better informed. So is Dr. Google an advantage to the patient and the doctor, or is there an impediment there, or is there a way of refining the knowledge that patients can inform themselves with before they seek consultation so that there can be a really intelligent conversation about this?
I think the net benefit is positive. I mean, basically the patient and or their family having a better understanding of what options are available and being able to have that dialogue, I think that's a net positive. With that,
I think as a clinician, I think it's a benefit for sure. I mean, it's a mixed blessing in some senses, because of course, your cranks are more likely to put negative things on the internet. But in general, I think it's been a very positive tool. People at least come in with some understanding or idea of what's going on. And then I think what happens is you have to really convince them this isn't science fiction, this is actually real. This is something that's been around for over 10 years. And is been used in over 100,000 patients, for instance, in deep brain stimulation. And often what we do is exactly what you pointed out, is to say, well, why don't you speak to someone else who's had this? And that can be a very compelling and powerful tool as well. So on the whole, the internet is very helpful in sort of at least bringing people into the door, but we still have to take that next step to get them across the threshold.
Lothar, are you wearing a Fitbit?
Well, actually, it's a Garmin, but yeah.
Okay. So that may be a precursor of what's coming down. We have a question from the audience. How do you think the latest non-invasive wearable monitoring and information technology, such as smartphones, can be used in brain implant pre-surgery planning and post-surgery evaluation? But it would seem to go beyond that. Are intelligent devices, such as our smartphones, going to become a greater part of our treatment, our medication?
I'm absolutely convinced of this. In fact, I've partnered with one of those companies that has one of those sensors to conduct a clinical trial and even do a commercial pilot to see whether devices like this can actually help to screen for patients that should get deep brain stimulation. But more importantly, as the audience member pointed out, if we have quantifiable measures pre and post treatment, we can make great arguments in the future world of pay for quality outcomes. And it's amazing to me over the last 3 or 4 years, the attitude of movement disorder specialists that I know has changed. 4 years ago, they might have said, gee, why do I need this device? That's my job, right? I know how to assess the patient. And now they say, I don't have time for this. I need outcomes. So they've really changed. They're actually embracing these technologies. And I think this is a great future of bringing this all together. And that's, no surprise, there's players that are entering the space that we said, gee, they're not device companies.
Could we project that just a little bit further? And could I ask each of you individually just to look further into the final frontier and see where you are now, where do you see us being in 5, 10 years' time as we project this technology to become more sophisticated and also become more accepted?
Well, for non-invasive neuromodulation with TMS, we're just scratching the surface with its application in treatment-resistant depression. That just happens to be a starting point. It's a very important starting point, and it's absolutely transformed the landscape of the care of patients at that stage of the illness. But this is clearly a platform that has applicability across a wide range of CNS diseases. We just alluded to a few of those in the discussion earlier about PTSD. But there's applications even well outside the area of psychiatry. Its use as an adjunctive technology in stroke rehabilitation, for example, is emerging. And in the future, this is going to play a much more meaningful role in healthcare than it does today.
Thank you. Emad.
So I think that, we're really on the verge of having many more rational treatments for a much broader range of indications. And I think the things that are likely going to start to be addressed are things like stroke rehabilitation, rehabilitation after traumatic brain injury, some of the psychiatric disorders we discussed, PTSD, depression, anxiety. And then I think coupled with that, there's, obviously enormous advances in the technology. So the idea is to develop, I think what the next generation of devices are going to be tailored devices that can basically interpret a patient's own neurophysiology and then devise a therapy that's most appropriate for that patient. And with the advances in miniaturization and so on, we imagine that these devices are going to be much smaller, implantable, not very obvious. And then that really opens up a whole new world of possible treatments. And again, numerically, if you add up all these potential indications, it's quite enormous. So I think the progress is going to occur in terms of the newer types of indications we're going to use, the technological approach we're going to use, relying on the patient's own physiology and devising rational approaches so the devices are actually tailored, and in terms of engineering advances in regard to miniaturization, better algorithms, better power utilization for smaller batteries, all those sorts of things. So there's many levels on which we'll advance.
Thank you. Frank.
What he said. Basically, I can't really add much to the broad description that Emad just gave, other than the fact that longevity is important, so rechargeable systems that could get added, sensing capabilities to look at different kinds of things. Right now, we look at electrical activity as a sensor. There could be other types of sensors that are put in the various implantable systems. Additional leads for being able to sense somewhere and stimulate somewhere else, and how many of those targets there may be. So you have that evolution of the technology, but I think the real challenge is going to be essentially doing all of the clinical trials to demonstrate that first the research to demonstrate you've got something, for a particular indication, and then the clinical trial to demonstrate it actually works.
As an entrepreneur, could you also address the future in terms of something being monetizable, and just as importantly, something could be done in country without having to outsource the technology? This is intellectual property which is residing here inside the US.
Yeah. Well, we're a perfect example of, we haven't done anything outside of the US. So a lot of the things you hear about with people having to go offshore and doing stuff there because of the regulatory issues, we started this. One of the few advantages I can think of having been in this game so long is that there was a period of time when FDA was very cooperative. And so we were able to get our first IDE to do a feasibility study on a cranial implant for epilepsy. It was 4 months from the submission to the approval. And now you'd be looking at it's getting better, but at the worst point, you'd be looking at 3 years at a minimum to be able to do that. So, we were able to get that activity going, both for a feasibility study and a pivotal trial, and then be able to get that basic clinical work done that didn't necessitate going outside of the country. But I think we also have a lot of initiatives right now on the part of FDA to try to do this and try to fast track some of these activities. So I think the pendulum is swinging back to where we ought to be able to get this accomplished without having to worry about outsourcing all this stuff.
Thank you. Lothar.
Yeah, let me go a little further out. And, you know, in my introduction, you know, you mentioned that I actually came to Medtronic to start some brain infusion programs. And obviously, there's been a lot of discussion about biotech and pharma here this morning. So I think today we are modulating, and mostly with electricity or magnetism, but we still are really inducing electricity. You know, we really need to be thinking about the repair or even the replacement of brain structures. And that's not science fiction, that's what we have today. Cochlear implants or vision restoration, what Second Sight is doing with their Argus 2 system. You know, we can restore vision and hearing, and that to me is replacing structures in the brain. So that's true, that's here. That will be, in my mind, applied to areas like stroke and certainly spinal cord injury. And the other one is if we don't fully replace a brain structure with a mechanical, electrochemical device, it may still be repaired through stem cells or through biotech drugs. But I think what we need to be thinking about is targeted drug delivery and systems that can chronically deliver biotech drugs to the brain to truly repair and restore function. So if I have a wish for our field, that we will see rapid progress here in the next 10 to 15 years to make these therapies real. We do have brain infusion today as well, and we just need to put these pieces together and really think about true neuro restoration that goes far beyond brain modulation where we are today.
Thank you, Lothar. Ben?
Well, I have the advantage of going last, which means I have to come up with all new things. But, you know, clearly, you know, I'd reiterate what's said here, but I think that I'd also just add, if we talked about technology, I think I'd expand that to innovation. And the thing that's going to make the difference, I think, to the field and innovation are, frankly, not the technology. The technology is often the easiest part of the puzzle to solve, and it's going to be the things like the clinical science, reimbursement. In the United States right now, there's no way to have funding in this critical period between when the product is approved and when you can survive a health technology assessment. So there has to be more innovative ways of bringing new therapies to the public. And I think that you know, this whole business about body wearable monitoring, whether it's connected through cell phones or otherwise, is going to just revolutionize how clinical studies are run, how ongoing collection of data is done. You know, we have, in our device, it's an implantable device, but there's an external component which, you know, allows the patient to apply the therapy, but it also keeps track of how the patient is doing. So we have years of data on thousands of headaches that allow us to continue to develop the evidence that the product is valuable to the medical economic system. And it's going to be those kinds of things that are going to really allow the therapies that are currently developed but woefully underpenetrated as far as being able to provide the benefit to the patients that need it.
Thank you. Thank you all for this. We've covered a lot of ground, and we're seeing this convergence in this new final frontier we're becoming aware of more publicly. It's very exciting, and it's also exciting to see how much intellect is being brought to bear and how relatively swiftly, regulatory issues notwithstanding, this is coming to the people for whom it's all designed, the end user, the patient, and hopefully that will continue to improve as the science improves, the technology improves, quality of life will improve. Thank you very much. Thank you.